Meister?
Paul Bäumer.
Ich möchte noch nicht loslegen.
Wahrheit und dein Recht.
Wir sind jetzt an der Westfront.
Wieder mehr als 40.000 Tote allein in den letzten Wochen. Es ist vorbei.
Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new, welcome to my channel. I'm Cam, and I'm so glad you're here. Today I'm going to be doing my full review of All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque. I got a lot out of this book, and I probably did not even, I think I started annotating it so much that I was like, I can't annotate everything I want to because every page is going to have something on it. This book was incredible. I would say this is probably the best war novel I've ever read that is really completely strictly about a war and focused on that. Probably the greatest overall war novel that I read that doesn't strictly deal with a war is probably War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, but that is war but also peace. Like, it's like half and half. This is 5 stars. It says the greatest war novel of all time. 100% true. The writing in this book is phenomenal. The language, it's poetic, but it's raw, it's super easy to read, it's very easy to digest. So this book is written from a German soldier's perspective from World War I. And what's really interesting to me about that is that you are reading and coming to know and care about characters that are what most of the world sees as the enemy in World War I. And it's very interesting that as you go on, you see this main character and his comrades as people and not as Germans. He's not as enemies, not as soldiers, but as people who got dragged into something that they didn't even want to be dragged into. And you start to really feel for them and care about them. And that's I think very important, because it's so easy to look at a conflict and just not see the people that get trapped in it. The author actually got in a lot of trouble for this book because in Germany it was considered anti-government, anti-patriotic, and apparently he had a follow-up novel to this, which I didn't realize until after I started to research him a little bit. He basically had to flee Germany. His messaging about the stupidity and the destruction and the waste of war was not popular with the government there, and if he wanted to stay free and alive, he had to get out. Take that into consideration while you're reading this book, because go into it with an open mind is what I would say. What were some of the things that I really loved about this book? Nature. He has a lot of nature imagery. He has a lot of talk. He talks a lot about not just the physical descriptions of the areas around him, the forests and the rivers and stuff, but the connection to nature, the connection to the earth itself. The earth becomes a living, breathing thing. It becomes an entity. The ocean becomes an entity to him. And it's something you don't tend to see, at least I haven't seen, in a lot of writing in general, but a lot of war novels. A lot of times the focus is on, the shell fire, the guns, the misery of the troops and stuff, but to have the nature around him become almost a character in and of itself was really interesting and really, really beautiful. So I would say probably at least a third of my annotations are where he uses that kind of imagery and language, and it just really stood out to me. Another thing that I really love about this book is his connection with his comrades and why he gets connected to them. He talks about them not just, well, you're a soldier and you have to be really close to your fellow soldiers. They spend so much time together, they really get to know each other, and they are so vastly different. They would never have met had it not been for being drafted and put into the same company. But they all learn to care about each other and to respect each other from all their different backgrounds. One is a poor farmer and that's all he wants to do is get back to his farm. One is was educated in the city and comes from a line of factory workers. So many different people, different ages even, and they become so close. But then it also contrasts that with sometimes nothing exists outside of your survival instinct. You don't think, your body just reacts. And different people will end up becoming wired by war one way or another. Some people are cowards, their fear instinct kicks in more so than anything else. And so, logic and reason goes out the window and they, come under fire and they run in the other direction. They're not ducking, they're not zigzagging, they're not taking cover, they're just running away and they're picked off. Other people would take off their gas masks without realizing or thinking about the fact that there was still poisonous gas around them, and it's because they couldn't handle the mask on their faces. So it talks about so many things about fear and about how you are wired due to the constant threat of death through these through combat. But I think the theme that I really appreciated the most was how war steals identity from people. And it was something that I really appreciated actually in Steinbeck's Once There Was a War, how he talks about the troops on the troop ship and how it's like you weren't seeing a crew of people on the deck of a ship, you were seeing mushrooms, because every man had on their rounded metal helmet. They were so packed in together, you couldn't see their faces, so they weren't individuals anymore. There's just a sea of mushrooms. It takes the individuality from people. The way that this book talks about it is that in this war, like in all wars, but in this war in particular, a lot of the men that were sent to the front, were drafted, were children. They were teenagers. They were just out of school, or they hadn't even quite finished school. And so it talks about how they don't know who they are. They don't have a life. They don't have an identity per se. They're transitioning from adolescence into adulthood, and in that transition, they start to discover who they want to be, what they want to do for a living, what they want to pursue, what kind of education do they want to go after, and it forms who they'll be for the rest of their lives. And war takes that, because in that transition period, it steals them away. That is their identity. They're soldiers. If they survive and get back, they're years older, they're past that typical point where they would make those decisions for themselves about how they want to pursue the rest of their life. They're not adolescents, but they're not even fresh young adults. They're traumatized and scarred, disfigured, battle fatigued soldiers, veterans, survivors that are going to see the world completely differently from then on. I loved that theme was explored throughout the entirety of the book. So I'm going to go through and read some of the quotes that kind of stood out to me about these themes, to try to entice everybody to maybe pick this up, because I really think it's worth it. So my very first one is what's it called? It's not the credits. It's normally where the dedication, where a lot of times the author will dedicate it. For this, he's basically making a statement to the reader instead of a dedication, and it says, "This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. I will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war." That's it. That is the definition of what this book is. That sets it up beautifully. Okay, so this really reflects something almost identically said in Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, which is really interesting because I think they were both published in the same year. Hemingway's was about the same war, but from the perspective of the Italian army, an American serving in the Italian army. And this is from the Germans fighting France and Italy. But they both had the exact same sentiment right at the beginning. And it says, "The wisest were just the poor and simple people. They knew the war to be a misfortune, whereas those who were better off and should have been able to see more clearly what the consequences would be were beside themselves with joy." The peasants know that war is the worst. Those more well off think war is an adventure, basically. So I have two, it's hard to see, but like this whole section and this whole section, instead of highlighting everything, I basically just kind of cordoned it off. He's talking about how at 18, they were basically betrayed by all the adults in their life who were supposed to be looking out for them, because the adults in their lives were pushing them to go to the war. They were encouraging them. They were talking about how glorious it is and how patriotic it is. You're serving the motherland. And then once these kids get there, they realize what a deep betrayal that is for all of those old or middle-aged or older men who pushed them into that, who get to stay safely behind and not fight. For us lads of 18, they ought to have been mediators and guides to the world of maturity, the world of work, of duty, of culture, of progress, to the future. We often made fun of them and played jokes on them, but in our hearts we trusted them. The idea of authority which they represented was associated in our minds with a greater insight and a more humane wisdom. But the first death we saw shattered this belief. We had to recognize that our generation was more to be trusted than theirs. They surpassed us only in phrases and in cleverness. The first bombardment showed us our mistake, and under it, the world as they had taught it to us broke in pieces. While they continued to write and talk, we saw the wounded and dying. While they taught that duty to one's country is the greatest thing, we already knew that death throes are stronger. But for all that, we were no mutineers, no deserters, no cowards. They were very free with all these expressions. We loved our country as much as they. We went courageously into every action, but also we distinguished the false from the true. We had suddenly learned to see, and we saw that there was nothing left of their world. We were all at once terribly alone, and alone we must see it through. Okay, the writing. The writing in this, and the fact, I love the fact that it readdresses over and over and over again this idea of lambs to the slaughter, those men that were supposed to care for them and guide them into maturity and into adulthood, threw them to the wolves. And they did it with a smile, and they did it with a pat on the back and with gusto, and were proud of themselves for pushing these kids onto the battlefield. And this is another one that I really loved. All the older men are linked up with their previous life. Now this is talking about older men in the army. They have wives, children, occupations, and interests. They have a background which is so strong that the war cannot obliterate it. We young men of 20, however, have only our parents, and some perhaps a girl. That is not much, for at our age the influence of parents is at its weakest, and girls have not yet got a hold over us. Besides this, there was little else. Some enthusiasm, a few hobbies, and our school. Beyond this, our life did not extend. And of this, nothing remains. We had as yet taken no root. The war swept us away. For the others, the older men, it is but an interruption. They are able to think beyond it. And it really makes you think, what does war of any kind, of any scale, shape young men into who don't have an identity already? Because he's absolutely right. It talks about men who the war is an interruption. You know, they're in their 30s, they're in their 40s, maybe even their professional career, military. So they get shipped off and they leave behind their entire life, their entire identity, their work, their wives, their children, their families, their established routines, their part and their place in the community. And it's simply an interruption, because when the war's over, that's what they go back to. They just pick up where they left off. These young men have nowhere to pick up. Their schooling is done. They don't have a career. They might go back to higher education, but at that time, and depending on their station in life, that's likely not what they would have done. They would have gone into a career. They would have probably found, you know, friends and community and a spouse and maybe had, you know, gotten married and had kids. And all of that is now stripped away. And the person that they could have been, they'll never be, because they're different now. The war will send them back. If it sends them back at all, it will send them back different in some way. And their life can never be what it would have been if they had not been sent to war. Their identity can never be what it would have been before the war got its claws into them. And it's just, that's what I love about this book. I think it explores that theme so beautifully, and it doesn't shove it down your throat, but it comes up just at the right intervals. It gives you enough of the sense of the battles that happen, the day-to-day struggles to survive. They didn't have enough to eat. They didn't have proper medical supplies. They didn't even have enough troops to, you know, keep rotating so that they weren't all completely exhausted and worn out. This book is so good. It's so good. So then it starts getting into a lot of the nature language once it kind of really gets into talking about like the battles and stuff. To me, this is one of the first real nature comparisons. And it says, "To me, the front is a mysterious whirlpool. Though I am in still water, far away from its center, I feel the whirl of the vortex sucking me slowly, irresistibly, inescapably into itself. From the earth, from the air, sustaining forces pour into us, mostly from the earth. To no man does the earth mean so much as to the soldier. When he presses himself down upon her long and powerfully, when he buries his face and his limbs deep in her from the fear of death by shell fire, then she is his only friend, his brother, his mother. He stifles his terror and his cries in her silence and her security. She shelters him and releases him for 10 seconds to live, to run, 10 seconds of life. Receives him again and often forever." Part of this he's talking about as the shells explode, they dig into the earth and they explode and they soften the earth and they leave these craters and these trenches that they also dig out. And so as a soldier is running and he hears a shell incoming, instinctually, he doesn't even think. The second his ear picks up that sound, he dives into the earth, and he dives literally not just to flatten himself, but to try to bury himself in all of this loose, upturned earth for as much protection as he can get. And he talks about how the most stable, supportive, and constantly there thing for a soldier is the earth, because that's the only thing that he can depend on in that moment. And it goes on, it even goes on and on past that. But that was the part of it that I really loved. And then he talks later about they're hearing this horrible sound. And at first they thought it was men who'd been hit by shell fire, and they were going to try to find these men to take them back to try to get help. And they realize it's not men. And it says, "The cries continued. It is not men. They could not cry so terribly. Wounded horses," says Kat. "It's unendurable. It is the moaning of the world. It is the martyred creation, wild with anguish, filled with terror and groaning." It's so good. The way that he talks about the destruction that war has on the earth itself, you know, the bombs exploding and literally destroying forests, destroying agricultural fields, destroying homes, and destroying the wildlife. You know, these horses are not just wild horses in the woods. They're horses that were brought to, you know, be part of the war. A lot of times to hitch up to things, to carry and haul things. And it talks about the character who's the most affected by this is a farmer. And so he has such a deep love for horses, and for him to hear it is absolutely unendurable. And so they risk their lives to find these horses, to put them out of their misery, because they're just in agony. And these men, they just can't take it anymore. They can't stand it. Something is in such pain. And so they're going to risk their lives to go and try to help. One of the guys says, "I tell you, it is the vilest baseness to use horses in the war." And to me, it's interesting, the idea that horses are too good and noble for war. but not men. He doesn't say that specifically, but I mean, if the basest and vilest thing is to use horses for war, but it's not more base and vile to put men to war, because horses are such a noble creature is what it's talking about. If men were too good for war, if men were that noble, there would be no wars. Basically, horses need to run the world, I think, is really what it's saying. There's another part just a page later where they're at is actually in an old cemetery. And so as the bombs are exploding, the shells are detonating, it's spewing up coffins and corpses along with the soldiers that it's killing that are just mixed in with the corpses. Now you have corpses that have been decades, they've been dead for decades, and then you have somebody who literally just expired next to each other. But it's really interesting too, because you have the imagery of all these bodies exhumed. It's such an on the nose, but very well done picture of what war does and how destructive it is and how it destroys and kills. And it says here, the shelling is stronger than everything. It wipes out the sensibilities. I merely crawl still farther under the coffin. It shall protect me, though death himself lies in it. So he actually takes shelter in one of the coffins that has been spewed out of the ground, and he survives this round of shelling because of it. So death has actually protected him from dying. I can't even describe how much this book was just so powerful to me. He says, coffins and corpses lie strewn about. They have been killed once again, but each of them that was flung up saved one of us. The most powerful force in war is death. And at the same time, death is what is actively preserving life for these soldiers. This book is amazing. I'm gonna read my absolute favorite quote from this book. It's the one that I have stuck way out here. This is about halfway through, and you can see a lot of these annotations. It's quotes about death, loss of identity, the death of the self before you even know who you are, and that death of self, even if it means that you continue to live and breathe. So this, to me, is the most powerful quote of the book. And this I know, all these things that now, while we are still in the war, sink down in us like a stone, after the war shall waken again, and then shall begin the disentanglement of life and death. I can't imagine what it would be like to have to disentangle myself from that kind of trauma at that formative age and somehow separate life from death and separate the fact that corpses were re-killed by this war, but death actively saved me from dying. How do you look at life? How do you look at anything going forward when that's formed your identity at that point? This is such a beautifully powerful book, and I really feel like everybody would benefit from reading it. And then he goes home on furlough. He actually gets his time to go home for a few weeks and rest before he reports back. And it's really interesting how, at the beginning he talks about how they were betrayed by all these men who sent them off to war. And when he comes home, he sees these same men, including his own father, who they want to hear about it. To them, it's an adventure. It's this glorious thing. They want to live vicariously through these young men that have gone to the battlefield, and that they think it's something to be proud of and to be excited about. And he's disgusted by it. He doesn't want to talk about it, and he certainly doesn't want to talk about it to people who are simply trying to sensationalize it and get their own sense of adventure vicariously through him. So he's talking about specifically his father. He wants me to tell him about the front. He is curious in a way that I find stupid and distressing. I realize he does not know that a man cannot talk of such things. I would do it willingly, but it is too dangerous for me to put these things into words. I'm afraid they might become gigantic and I be no longer able to master them. What would become of us if everything that happens to us out there were quite clear to us? And I feel like that goes so much with the previous quote about they cannot disentangle life and death while they're in the war. And even though he's on furlough, he knows he's going back to the front. they know that they have to suppress and repress all of this within themselves, and they can't think about it. They cannot process it while they're there. And that's another theme that goes throughout this book, is knowing that they cannot spend too much time thinking about it. They have to simply move and survive. And that once they're out of the war, whether they win or lose, if they make it through and they survive, then they can start thinking about it. Then they can start processing it. And I think that is so accurately reflected of every war and every soldier who makes it out. The trauma that they have gone through and the life that they begin to lead, and all the problems that they have in struggling to reacclimate to a non-war society and a non-war life. A lot of times they're not ready yet even to disentangle it, and that they can't do it by themselves, that they cannot give themselves the mental health support alone that they need to recover from that and to find themselves again and to deal with all that loss and all that destruction and their share in it. So part of his time at home, he's back in his childhood home, in his childhood bedroom, and he goes up, and he used to love to read, and so he thinks, maybe I'll go up and read some of my books again. That'll make me feel better. That's something that I've always enjoyed doing. And the realization that that part of him has kind of been taken away from him by the war, to me was really touching. And so he talks about it here. The backs of the books stand in rows. I know them all still. I remember arranging them in order. I implore them with my eyes. Speak to me. Take me up. Take me, life of my youth. You who are carefree, beautiful. Receive me again. I wait. I wait. Images float through my mind, but they do not grip me. They are mere shadows and memories. I stand there dumb as before a judge, dejected. Words, words, words. They do not reach me. Slowly, I place the books back in the shelves. Nevermore. Quietly, I go out of the room. This book is so sad, but it's done in such a way that it feels so powerful and meaningful, and that it gets its point across so well without making the reader like so depressed that they can't go on with it. So the last one I'm going to end with is it's kind of wrapping up. They know that they're going to lose. They know that the war's almost over. There's just every sign points to they're not going to make it continually. Their supplies are running out. Their food has run out. They've run out of men, and they just need to survive for a little longer to be able to go home. And he says, how senseless is everything that can ever be written, done, or thought when such things are possible. It must be all lies and of no account when the culture of 1,000 years could not prevent this stream of blood being poured out, these torture chambers in their hundreds of thousands. A hospital alone shows what war is. So this comparison of hospitals to torture chambers, you've got, spaghetti, you've got meatball surgery going on where the guts are literally just spaghetti from the shell fire, and they're just trying to desperately patch it up enough that the kid doesn't die, doesn't bleed out. You've got amputations that are going on. A hospital alone shows what war is. I mean, you can look at a battlefield and how destroyed, the area is, and homes are, and even bodies on the ground. But to be in a hospital, you're seeing the remnants of what's clinging to life and how destroyed that is. Because once death comes, it's done. It's over for that person. But to be brutalized physically by the war and to survive it is a whole nother torture. And my note is that death cannot compete with the misfortune of surviving. And it's not even, there is some survivor's guilt, but sometimes it's not even survivor's guilt. A lot of the ones who've been injured talk about how they wish they had just died because their body is so destroyed. They think, what was I saved for? What kind of life can I have if I'm going to be constantly in pain? I've lost limbs. I've lost, my face is disfigured. My capacity to care for myself and to have a life that I wanted to have is now gone. And that's something that each person has to go through and decide, is that eventually how they're going to feel? Are they going to come out of it? Are they going to be happy that they survived? But for many, survival was worse than had they simply been killed and it be over with. Okay, wait, let me see what the very last quote is. Okay, I love this one too. So, we are little flames poorly sheltered by frail walls against the storm of dissolution and madness in which we flicker and sometimes go out. That paper-thin boundary between sanity and losing yourself and between hope and despair is this book so beautifully brings that to the forefront. And then finally, I will end it. Okay, this is the last quote because this is the last one that I highlighted in the book. And men will not understand us, for the generation that grew up before us, though it has passed these years with us, already had a home and a calling. Now it will return to its old occupations and the war will be forgotten. And the generation that has grown up after us will be strange to us and push us aside. We will be superfluous even to ourselves. We will grow older, a few will adapt themselves, some others will merely submit, and most will be bewildered. The years will pass by, and in the end, we shall fall into ruin. Even if you don't like books about war, I would highly recommend this book because yes, it does talk about actual descriptions of warfare, of being in the trenches, of, taking cover from machine guns and from shells and things, but so much more. The book is an observation of what that environment does to somebody, what it does to an entire generation, how it affects the generation before and the generation after, how it deals with trauma, the border between life and death, the border between identity and lack of identity, and having your future stolen from you. And for what? What is the purpose? Why? What are they getting out of it? Who is making these decisions? Who is sending these young men to war, and for what purpose? It's beautiful, and I think it is such a powerful story that it gives you a person to focus on. It lets you feel things through them and see things through them instead of being in third person, which tends to be my preferred writing method and voice. It brings you into it and it makes you really go along with them and feel what they're feeling, and it changes. A lot of people today are anti-war, and they know that it's destructive and it's powerful and that it is nothing but evil. But if you haven't experienced it yourself, it's also kind of abstract, and I think this book takes it from abstract and it gives you a dose of reality that you're very likely not going to get otherwise. And so I think this is a really valuable story to read and to experience. And I would recommend the heck out of this book. And like I said, it is not that long. It is 294 pages, 295 pages. It's incredibly quick. It's very small. Even though it's 295 pages, they're very small pages. The font is decently large. It's easy to get through. And it is incredibly deep. But it's so easily digestible at the same time. So I definitely recommend this book. I really hope that I've piqued your interest in it and that you're willing to pick it up. And please tell me in the comments below what you think of this book. If you've read it, please tell me your thoughts on it. If you haven't read it, has any of this made you interested in reading it? Do you have other recommendations for books that you think are similar to this that I would enjoy? Because I think this is a genre and a topic and themes that I really, really like to explore in literature. So if you have any recommendations, please down in the comments below, leave me your recommendations. Let me know your thoughts on this and if you're intending to read it. And once you have read it, please come back and tell me what you think of it, because I would love to hear what other people think of this. I have never come across anybody that has read it. So yeah, please let me know what you think. That is all. Knocking stuff over. That is all for me today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel, and I'm trying to get this thing off the ground. So thank you so much for joining me. Please take care of yourself, take care of others, drink your water, get some sun, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.